Hello everyone, I'm Darcy Bono, and in this video I'm going to show you how to paint the colors of Greywater Fastness, the most firepower-obsessed city in all of the mortal realms. Now, with the new Cities of Sigmar release, I have these new cool models here, and we're going to be taking care of these with contrast paints. As you can see, there are a lot of details, and contrast paints allow us to knock them out very efficiently. Just a heads up, the miniature on the left is actually a kit bash of the relic carrier. It had been a guy with a head in a box on a stick, and while I appreciate the medieval reference, I thought a pistol or giant handgun from the Pistoliers would be more appropriate for a Greywater Fastness soldier. Since we're working with contrast paints, we're going to want to start with a light primed miniature. The brighter white this is, the more vibrant your subsequent layers are going to be. So this one has been primed with white scar spray. Before we get to our fun, vibrant yellow, we need to knock out the darker colors first, such as the iron on his armor. So that being said, we're going to start with a black base coat. You can use any black that you want. In this case, I'm using AK Interactive Black. I just like this one because it is very opaque and very smooth and just gives an instant coverage over this white. So we're doing this because we're going to be stippling over top later using a silver, and this is in turn going to give us a slightly more scuffed, a little more rugged look to our armor without being fully weathered. So really not much to this, just base coat all your metal surfaces black. And in this case, I'm actually testing out a new brush. I'm using an Artist Opus Size 4 Series S, and I've got to say it is very nice as far as control goes. It has a nice crisp point. For even being a large brush, I'm able to get in these recesses very easily. Full disclosure, they did send me this brush to test out, so I'm doing so. This is literally my first time using it, and I'm honestly finding that it does live up to the hype as far as providing precision when applying your paint. But I don't want to turn this into a commercial. Use whatever brush you're comfortable applying base coats with. It's totally fine. Just base coat black where all your metal surfaces are going to be, and we'll move on. Once your base coats have completely dried, you're now ready to move on to stippling. If you've seen my videos before, you'll know I generally use an ELF concealer brush, a small makeup brush, but again, since Artist Opus sent me their product to test out, that's what I'm going to do. I'm using their Series D Small. So if you haven't stippled before, it's very similar to dry brushing, where you just get a very tiny amount on just the tip of your brush and then lightly jab your model. It's not a full tilt dry brushing where you flick it back and forth, you just kind of lightly pat it, and as you'll see, it'll make a nice kind of speckled pattern. It gives a nice rugged look to your armor that we're then going to dull down later with contrast paints. The silver I'm using is Vallejo Game Air Silver, but any bright silver will do the trick. For these smaller portions, I've switched to the Series D Extra Small, just to give me a little bit more control since it's closer to the fabric. But there's really not much more to say, just continuously stipple until your armor's a nice rugged metal. In order to turn our silver into a nice industrial metal, we're going to use a very thin shade coat of Black Legion Contrast. Now, Black Legion Contrast is very opaque. I have thinned the heck out of this with 3 drops of Lahmian Medium. Lahmian Medium tends to make things a bit more transparent than just Contrast Medium and lets it act more like a shade coat, which is what we need. As you can see, it flows like water at this point. So then just apply this shade coat to your metal and you'll see right away it turns it into a nice deep iron color. Black Legion is a very brown black, which makes it perfect for a more industrial looking metal. For an even more industrial look, I actually added a just tiny speck of Rattling Grime contrast to my Black Legion shade coat. Rattling Grime is a dark grayish brown, so it really enhances the brown that's already in Black Legion, giving a perfect battle-worn look. Next, to add just a little bit more definition to the armor, I'm just going to do a recess shade with the exact same mixture I used before, Black Legion with that little tiny bit of Rattling Grime mixed in. It just darkens the recesses, adds a bit more texture to this weathered armor, and picks out the nicks and battle damage. And just so you can better see the difference between Black Legion and Black Legion with Rattling Grime, this is just the Black Legion, no Rattling Grime mixed in. It gives a much deeper, darker iron than the grayish brown on the pauldron. I'm not really worried about consistency of color when it comes to weathering this armor. It's industrial metal. Just have fun with it and feel free to adjust the ratios however you like, depending on how much brown you want, how much silver you want to show through. If you want it to be lighter, use more Lahmian Medium so that silver shows through more. And that's pretty much it. For me personally, I'm going to keep this just Black Legion, no Rattling Grime worked into it, because I want a more monochrome black, because I know I'm going to be painting the tunic yellow. If I work in Rattling Grime, it's going to turn it to a brown black, that's a warm color, and it'll be right next to another warm color. So for the sake of contrast and to break up that amount of warmth, I'm just keeping this a more neutral colored armor. Okay, I adjusted my lighting so this is closer to how your eye perceives it rather than the last frame. Now that we've got our nice rugged armor done, we can just add a few additional highlights. And to do this, you can either use Iron Hand Steel, Lead Belcher, Scale 75 Thrash Metal is another good one, any kind of brownish silver, just to pick out the edges and scratches on this armor. And just to show how good these are when tackling very fine details, this is the Artist Opus Series S size 0. They do come several sizes smaller than this one, but this is proving just fine in making very fine brush strokes. And I get that it stands for Sigmar, but is anyone else seeing like the 90s S that kids used to draw in school back in the day? Maybe I'm insane, but I can't unsee that now. Anyway, nonsense moment over. Just go ahead and pick out the edges and any scratches you'd like to make on your armor using Lead Belcher or Iron Hand Steel. And there's actually a spot of metal I forgot. I'm just applying Vallejo Game Air Silver to this little tiny chainmail strip here. Once it was dry, I applied Rattling Grime straight from the pot, realized it was too much, so I just rinsed my brush and then used the damp brush to just pull away some of the excess so the lighter silver would show through and wouldn't be quite as dark as the metal around it. Before we move on to the fabric, I'm just touching up a few spots where I got paint where it shouldn't be. I'm just bringing it back to that white layer that I started with. Using Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White, it matches White Scar Spray perfectly as they're both pure whites. So just fix any mistakes and you can move on to the fun part. Just so there's no confusion, in these next few shots you're going to see me use contrast medium. Previously I've been using Lahmian medium. Just to touch on the differences, they are incredibly similar mediums. They're both used to thin your paints and make them more transparent, therefore making your colors brighter due to the light underlayer showing through. The main difference I found between contrast medium and Lahmian medium is just how your paint flows. For example, with Lahmian medium, it's much more liquid, it's much more like a shade coat. I use Lahmian medium when I want a more subtle color on the raised portions with more heavily tinted shadows or recesses. Contrast medium I use more like a glaze, where I want everything tinted without oversaturating the recesses. It'll basically allow the raised portions to be very heavily tinted by the color of your contrast paint without flowing too much into the shadows. It's just not quite, it doesn't have the same viscosity as when you use Lahmian medium. So, that being said, you can use them interchangeably. You can use Lahmian medium with contrast paints, but in the next few shots you're going to see me using contrast medium mixed into my contrast paints just because I want them to tint the entire surface more heavily than when I use Lahmian medium. I'm going to go ahead and take care of his boots really quickly. This is Wildwood Brown and contrast medium mixed in a 2-to-1 ratio. I don't even need to highlight after I apply this because the contrast paint does exactly what it's supposed to do over a very textured surface. And since we're discussing brushes more in this video, this is just an old Citadel layer brush that I've had forever. I use it to apply my contrast paints because it doesn't hold a point anymore because I've used them with contrast paints. As you see, the paint gets very far down into the bristles closer to the ferrule, and that's actually what causes your brush to splay out and lose its tip. Which in this case, it's fine. I want wide strokes when I'm applying this. It's just a fun, messy technique. We don't need to be fine detail. So ideally, when applying contrast paints, don't use your best brushes. A simple synthetic that you are comfortable controlling is perfectly fine. For the iconic yellow on Greywater Fastness soldiers, we're using Nosdrag Yellow Contrast and Contrast Medium, and it's going to be a nice, smooth glaze like that. Nosdrag Yellow does create a rich golden color, but it's one of the original contrast paints, so it's not made for smooth surfaces. In order to get it to go on smoothly, act almost like you're shaving. Do like a line, a thin swipe, and then another right next to it. On the more textured surfaces, you don't need to worry about this quite as much, but for big wide surfaces like the back of his tunic, as you can see, I'm just applying it in smooth individual swipes. Next, you can use either Averland Sunset or the legendary Duncan Rhodes' new Two Thin Coats Skulker Yellow. It's a little bit lighter than Averland Sunset, so honestly I would probably use this for highlights, but to do a basic mid-tone highlight and smooth out some of the oversaturated spots, Averland Sunset will work just fine. So all I'm doing here is just applying thinned Averland Sunset as if it were a base coat, just a nice smooth thin coat, over top of these oversaturated parts. Basically, they just looked a little too dark for where they were on the model, so I'm lightening them a little bit. It's just a standard layer highlight. Now, to show you the difference between the two, Averland Sunset and Duncan Rhodes' Skulker Yellow, this is the highlight color I'm using for these very fine folds in the fabric. So it's just slightly lighter, a little more vibrant, not quite as ochre. If you don't have access to this paint and you still want to do a vibrant, fine edge highlight, you could always use Aerial Yellow. It's a little more saturated, a little more vibrant, so you may need to use it a bit more sparingly just so you don't have too much contrast or unrealistically like glaring contrast. But this is Duncan Rhodes' Skulker Yellow, so I highly recommend this if you want to add edge highlights to Nosdrag and Averland Sunset. Now on to the blue. The original Greywater Fastness color scheme had quite a bit of blue to it compared to the new one, which is mostly just iron and ochre yellow, but like my cool Warcry warband here, I'm going to use this as the secondary color. Unfortunately, my camera thought it would be really cool to randomly stop recording while I was filming this. No problem, it's one of the easiest parts of the process. I'll show you what to do using this shield. All I did was mix Storm Fiend Contrast, it's this very gorgeous blue, with Black Templar in an even ratio, and you get this nice greenish deep teal color. Now, if you want it a little more blue instead of this greenish blue here, just use a tiny bit more Storm Fiend, and that's pretty much it. That's a very textured surface. This doesn't have any contrast medium in it. If you want a lighter, almost robin's egg color blue that looks very nice with this darker one, just add a little bit of contrast medium to your mix. It makes it transparent so the white shows through and makes a lighter blue. To make his gloves a nice cream color, I'm mixing 1 drop of Skeleton Horde, 1 drop of Silicanum Gray, and 3 drops Lahmian Medium, again making it extra transparent, and applying it over his gloves very sparingly. I also use the exact same mixture on his leggings. Continuing to knock out the details very quickly, I'm now applying Black Templar Contrast straight from the pot to his straps and pouch on his back. Later you'll see these are slightly highlighted. All I did was mix in just the tiniest little speck of white into my Black Templar, just undiluted Black Templar, and you get basically the equivalent of Mechanica Standard Gray. It's just a kind of greenish gray, and applied that to the edges as a highlight. As far as applying contrast paints to fine details, I just use a synthetic brush because, again, I don't like using my sable brushes with contrast paints just due to how far they soak into the bristles, causing them to lose their point. The brush I'm using is just a Michaels store brand. It's Artist Loft Vienna. I'm fairly certain that's only through Michaels, and it is a size 18/0, so very small, but it's fairly stiff, so it actually gives you really good control for how small it is. Okay, moving on to the face. Now, as everyone knows, painting faces takes a high level of black magic, and I was told due to the level of graphic violence and nudity, that wasn't going to be tolerated in a GW-sponsored video, so I'm going to show you just a very basic, very beginner-friendly version of how to paint faces to a tabletop standard. There is a video in my channel as well, I'll link it in the video description, that gives a few other skin tones that you can paint on faces very easily. Just a quick tip, before you start painting any skin on the face, paint the hair first so you don't end up getting this color on your nice skin. This is just Skeleton Horde, straight from the pot, gives you a nice blonde hair tone. As an optional fine highlight, you can use a yellow ivory in order to pick out some of the fine details on the hair. I'm using Huge Miniatures Tuscan Sun. Citadel Flayed One Flesh works as well. I just like this just because it's a little bit more yellow, a little bit more saturated. Alright, now for the face itself. This is just Guilliman Flesh Contrast with 1 drop of Lahmian Medium mixed in, again to make it extra transparent and not to tint the cheeks too heavily. This will also extend the drying time of the paint, which is important because if you put on a bunch of paint like I'm doing here, you can then rinse your brush off and then use it to kind of push that paint around so it doesn't dry too quickly and come up in patches. So if you notice that you've got oversaturation, just rinse the paint off your brush and then use your damp brush, not a wet brush, but just with most moisture out of it, to push around the paint that's currently on the surface of the face. And again, this exact same technique is in a video that's already on my channel. I'll include it in the video description. It just gives you a few more options as far as skin tone. So in a nutshell, just apply your mixture of Guilliman Flesh, rinse your brush, and then push that paint around until you're satisfied with the saturation and highlights of the skin. Just to point out a few details that were a bit too minimal to record, I put the exact same skin tone on his hand, and then the handle of the gun is actually just straight wildwood brown, unthinned. Next, for the scabbard of the sword, all I did was apply Black Templar Contrast straight from the pot. For the remaining metal portions of the sword, I'm just applying Vallejo Game Air Silver, which once it's dried, I'm going to turn into a muted bronze color. While I wait for the silver on the sword to dry, I'm going to go ahead and take care of the barrel of the gun. I went ahead and just base coated that silver instead of having it stippled because I thought it would look a little bit too much like the armor, so just base coated Vallejo silver. Then I'm applying Basilicanum Gray Contrast straight from the pot. For the bronze of the metal of the sword, I just mixed a speck, a tiny just tip of the paintbrush speck of Basilicanum Gray into a full drop of Skeleton Horde Contrast until I got this muted tan color and applied that over the silver. You can kind of flavor this to taste depending on how yellow you want this, but you don't need to dilute it because Skeleton Horde Contrast is already very thin and dilutes the Basilicanum Gray to the point where it's already fairly transparent. Okay, the final little detail, the little comet emblem hanging off his sword, the thread of which I painted with Black Templar because why not? So all I did was base coat the emblem in silver again. We're then going to turn that into a copper using Gore-Grunta fur. The reason I chose copper was because we've already got yellow behind it, so I can't make it gold. We've got bronze right next to it, and then we've got monochrome metals all over this miniature. So I basically chose copper just so it wouldn't look exactly like everything else, but still fit in with the color scheme. So that is it. Start to finish Greywater Fastness Fighters painted. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe as it makes me want to make other videos when I know that people are actually watching and enjoying my content. That being said, there's also going to be a tutorial on the wintry basing. Like most of what I do, it's actually insanely easy to pull off, so make sure to subscribe so you can check that out in the future. If you want to support the channel, feel free to visit my Ko-fi link in the video description. It functions as a digital tip jar. So thanks again for joining me, and until we meet again, happy painting, everyone.